Hello. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Buonasera a tutti. I'm Moira Egan, and I'm here very happily today to talk about my new book, The Furies, which is recently out with LSU Press, to whom I am very grateful for this beautiful object in the world. The cover is frescoes from Roman frescoes, appropriately enough, since that's where I live usually. From the Palazzo Massimo, right near the train station. You've probably walked by it. And if you walk by it, next time you should definitely go in. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. I can't see you, but I hope you can see me. And here comes a lovely stream of light. This book is divided into sections, into 6 sections. So I thought I would do a little walking tour of each of the sections and maybe read a poem from each. The basis for the book was we live in interesting times, and one feels a bit of fury. Fill in why. The book deals with, as you've probably seen, a sense of the silencing of women, both in mythology, in history, even sometimes currently. Voice is an important aspect of the book. And there are environmental concerns, obviously, all the things we're worried about, let's just say that, and about which one can be furious, and one often is. To show you, I was just having a conversation with Corey, thank you. The most beautiful table of contents I've ever seen, if we say so ourselves, thank you, Michelle, the book designer, they look like columns. They look like ancient columns. So that made me very happy that my table of contents is columns. So section by section, I will begin at the beginning, which is uncharacteristic, but I'm going to do it anyway. The first section of the book is a sonnet crown. And I'm sure you know that thus the first line of the crown becomes the last line of the crown. And that's why it's called a crown, because it's shaped like one. Before I tell you the title, I will tell you where it came from. I've taught the Odyssey a number of times, and most recently I was teaching the translation by Emily Wilson, which is the first translation done by a woman into English. And I like that translation. I think she got a lot of things right. But I think that a lot of the female characters in the Odyssey still had something to say. I also would like to give a shout out to my pressmate and dear friend, Christopher Bakken, who may be out there, who first published this sonnet crown on the great online zine called Ergon. So with all that introduction, the crown is called Group Therapy for the Female Characters of the Odyssey. And I'll just read the first one, which is Penelope, and then I'll walk you through the other characters briefly. So, of course, it should start with Penelope, shouldn't it? I tell them, though they never get it right. I stood beside that pillar, my full height, Athena wrought Pylades. It was me. My strength and cunning were the husbandry that kept our house erect. I used my looks, I mean both, glances veiled, and my hook, my beauty, if a little wrinkled now. But still they wanted me. I was their sow, domestic, they, the rustic rutting boars, the very root of hybrid, it would seem, the root also of hubris. Seamen, seem, the men are praised for coming back from wars. I held our house together, son unharmed, and I will be remembered for my charms. And then we move in and through the siren, a siren, Circe, Scylla, and Charybdis. I hope I've done my work and you now have an earworm for the rest of the day, being caught between the Scylla and Charybdis. And then beloved young Nausicaa. And then finally the nurse, Euryclea. And why not give this nice old lady a voice? I will read Euryclea's poem. And you remember, she saw, when he came back, she saw. Some days I'd wished I'd had a different home. It hurt my heart when every night she'd moan, no way to know, she's crying, or a dream had taken her, the men downstairs who seemed to overpower her despite her will. I hardly slept at night at all until I felt him out there. I knew he was near. But I am old, invisible. My years, they make me silent. So when he returned, he nearly kicked my bucket, nearly choked me right there on the spot. I sputtered, croaked, I know you more than anyone. I've learned the story isn't ever black or white. I tell them, though they never get it right. So we can say a large part of the project of this book is telling so that something will be made clear. The next section has the strange, perhaps made-up name, or maybe not, but there's the word fraternal, and I guess there's the word sororal, as in sisterly, but who uses it? And this is a section that deals with mortality, angers, imperfections, difficulties in living, all that good stuff, but always with an undernote of support, of sororal support, of speaking it, naming it and claiming it, and then moving on kind of thing. Not to sound too woo-woo-y, but in fact, in a slightly woo-woo-y vein, why don't I read this one? It's a villanelle. So I play around a lot with traditional forms. You just heard two sonnets. I find form not at all constricting, but rather freeing because it puts my imagination into places that I think it wouldn't have gone, perhaps. So this is a villanelle. And if the character in the final stanza seems like it might be James Joyce, it is James Joyce. And I guess he ended up in there because why not? But also because of the rhyme that I was working with, because it's a villanelle. So, flawed. I never do exactly as I should. I broke the vase, rearranging the flowers, and perfect is the enemy of good. The painting teacher told us that it's good to lay down light, then dark in watercolors. I never do exactly as I should. The little girl who squished about in mud, parental expectations, sweet, then soured, when perfect was the synonym of good. I left behind that lovely boy who would have married me, fair creature of an hour. I never do exactly as I should. The coulda, woulda, shoulda, all wormwood and hazardous to psyche, all devour, as does the perfect enemy of good. At dawn, that polyglottal poet stood, his arms outstretched atop Martello Tower. I never do exactly as I should, and perfect is the enemy of good. Pardon? So the next section is perhaps the weirdest section in the book. It's very much a product of lockdown. And I should have said too that this book, a lot of it was written actually during lockdown, or in the aftermath. As you know, we in Italy were very much locked down, and it was a difficult time, as obviously. I mean, all around it was, all around the world, but I was stuck in the flat for, I don't even know, 3 or 4 months. So to keep sane, as much as that is possible, I began to play every night Moira rules Scrabble. I won't go into the Moira rules because they're slightly complicated, but I was explaining this to my nephew the first Christmas we were released from lockdown and I was able to come back to the States. And I'm telling them this story of what I was doing to entertain myself. And he said, oh, so basically you invented bananagrams. And I said, what's bananagrams? And guess what I got for Christmas, which was nice. But this section of poems had pretty much already been written. So the way it works with these anagrams is that most of them are written in couplets. In fact, almost all of them but one. And instead of, if this is a couplet, instead of having rhyming end words, the end words are anagrams of each other. The end word or words are anagrams. So you still will have, it's not, obviously it's not going to rhyme, but you still have consonants and assonants that tie the sound patterns together. And you know, I think, I don't think I've ever read this one, and it just occurred to me that given the situation of me speaking to you on Zoom, one I wrote, its real title. So the other thing is the real titles appear at the bottom of the poem, and then the anagrammed titles appear at the top. So the real title of this one, and especially the teachers out there who had to teach on Zoom and everyone else, but the real title is Monitor Ennui. And the anagrammed title is our omen, isn't it? Sitting here twiddling fingers, wistful legend hid, writ not in water, but on a screen so plain and mean, no sane crone would deign to touch it. A dark so dark I'm induced to goth. Then, oh joy, a pop-up, wine bar. Oh, wait, no. It's just a webinar. How to succeed on Zoom. So much merda. Musing, fusing the old sweet dream of connection. Oh, poor brain, your rewired synaptics, a path so hapless and weird. I long lovingly for a getaway. But all we got's this cut-rate gateway to a bunch of boring left brain tips and no delicious sniff and swirl and spit. Ring lamp, silk scarf swath, firm pout. We're all so stunning from the waist up. F and blind this endless winding safari of roads untouched, each as just as fair. So you may wonder if my bananagrams related game kept me sane or made me less. Either way, the poems came. This one is this is the last anagram in the section. And it's also the only one whose genuine title actually finishes the sentence, the final sentence of the poem. So I'm not going to read the real title first. I will just read the anagrammed title, and then you'll hear what the title is when I finish. Excuse me. And this is an elegy for my father, for all the poets, for all the mentors, for the losses. So ravage this. What to leave at his anathema grave? Mexican sugar coke, bitter agave, all the shoulds, woulds, coulds. Gray, the negative capable clouds, a subjunctive funk of weather slide by. A grief-laid wreath on black granite. Sharply carved the name, water writ, craved fame, wisdom, wit, or wist. Mentor, master of subtle torments, to him I raise this chalice, rim dipped, sugar, salt, citrus. Chimerical the blessed boozy, bluesy moods and all nine muses bloody in his wake. Yet, eminence grise, beloved sometimes, solely to verse obliged. Left so lonely, I can only listen, sitting, cross-legged, silent, at his grave. And it's an obvious one, but it's one of the best anagrams in the English language, I think. Silent and listen. So the next section is actually called Plague Poems. Quite, they were written during the plague. And since my husband Damiano, I assume, is out there, hello, my darling, and he is not only a literary translator, but also an epidemiologist. So you can imagine that the household was even a bit more fraught than your average plague household. So I wrote this little poem playing around with hissing sounds, spitting, anger, kissing, not kissing, and starting with the title, which is Mrs. Epidemiologist. Where we don't kiss, don't mix spit, only rarely now in anger do I hiss, cat claws, complaints useless, our little house. Sun shines outside, bliss, and outside you persist. Stay away from us, please, oh little virus. Um, do, 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 do. I'm going to read a sort of coming out of lockdown poem. Um, and not only do I like working in traditional forms, but I also like to invent my own, like anagrams, or like this little weird thing, which has a very strict rhyme scheme, an assonant rhyme scheme, all O sounds. You can imagine why, O, except the O sounds occur at the beginning of the line rather than the end of the line. So, and I think that's all I need to tell you. It's called whelm. Note from a friend. So sorry I haven't written. I'm just overwhelmed. Overused, undermeant, you know. I hate to say that word. I know. But I can't help wonder. Overwhelm? I know the over, but the whelm? Middle English, to turn over, capsize, turn upside down. No surprise. Perhaps from Old English, arched, concave. Icelandic, overturn. Ancient Greek, kolpos, bosom, hollow, gulf. And though I have a house, a home, and know how fortunate I am, oh, when I see that word, overwhelm, sea-tossed, lonely, I think of that prodigious wave, tsunami, and oh, the terrible sigh, hokusai. A poet friend of mine yelled at me about that last line, but I sort of like it. Well, he didn't really yell. He just said, is that really what? Yes, it was what I wanted. Because, I think we all felt a lot of tsunami in those days. And the next section is the eponymous heroinic sonnet crown. So the Furies. It's my first heroic crown, though it's heroinic. And I would also like to give a shout out to my friend Alexis Sears, who, though many decades younger than I, already went ahead and wrote a really great heroic crown. And I said to myself, if Alexis can do it, so can I. So I'm going to read one, I think. This is the many angers, but also this is the more kind of historical one. There are women painters, there are mythological figures too. And I'm trying to decide which one do I want to read. I hate when people do that, but I'm doing it. Forgive me. Um, yeah, I'm going to read this one, which is about the first known author. Forget about Homer and those guys. This was Enheduanna, who's the first woman, I mean, the first author and the first woman associated in an authorial way with work. And there was a nice exhibition in New York a couple of years ago, which sadly I missed. But what was the woman doing with the tablet in her lap? Why did the archaeologists have to ask? Well, obvious, the voicelessness a given. Did she not write hymns and sonnets to sun and moon and blood and distant planets? Of course, you've heard the joke. Anonymous was woman, woman born, to take the piss. Her silly work, the critics piss upon it. My friend sent me an essay, Stamina, from Latin, plural, stamen, in the sense of threads spun by the fates. And Heduana persisted, poet, priestess, ornament of heaven. My Lord, that which here has been created, no one has created before. And so this one skips around a little bit, and I'm going to read you one of the last ones. Do, do, do. And there's a not nice word in it, which I'm going to substitute with a less not nice word. So if you get the book, you will see. I just don't want to offend anyone out there in Zoom land. And yes, that's all I'll say. I'd wish to offend no one out in Zoom land. And this is the penultimate one before the final sonnet, which I'll say something about. Head bangs against the door. never enough to rise above the risible, to view beyond the visible, to clear the channel, staticky, to slough the slough of despond off, to learn to tough it out, the mire of miserable, the insult of invisible, Houdini out the existential cuffs. I know, girl, right? Where's your gratitude? How far you think you'll get with this attitude? You think I'm going to go there with some platitude, and you'd be right. The irony of life is hardly anyone gets out alive, and bees are not returning to their hive. And so the self-deprecating thing that I want to say about the final sonnet, the 15th sonnet, the crown, which is supposed to just take the repeating lines and make a sonnet with those lines in that order in which they've been repeated. It was terrible. So I'm sitting there, what am I going to do? If you want to write a heroic crown, my advice is start with the sonnet and then work backwards. But anyway, I turned it into an index inspired by Terence Hayes's uh, American Sonnets for My Once and Future Assassin and those indexes. That's what I did. So thank you also, Terence Hayes. All right, so we're coming to the end of my magical mystery tour of the book. And appropriately enough, the last section is called Mystical Visions of Saints and Sinners. This is a different kind of myth. It's a hit or myth. It's Moira grappling with her lapsed, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave Catholic self. And I'm just going to read the last poem in that section, which is also the last poem in the book, and which has a sweetly funny story, I think. Thank you to the Hopkins Review for first publishing this poem. And then thank you for nominating it for an anthology I didn't know existed, the best spiritual literature. The best spiritual literature. Moira Egan has a poem now in that, and I'm very happy about that. Maybe it's a sign from, and just to explain, the title is velar, which is a linguistic term, which is when you make a sound, when your tongue is working with the membrane in the back of your throat. And etymologically, it's related to words like veil, vellum, things that have to do with a kind of membrane. And so here is the poem. Velar. She said that faith is her anchor, but I heard anger. Fragile, fraught faith, bells and beeswax candles, a baseless base, frankincense and myrrh, common sense thrown out the stained glass window. Those characters we studied in the minster windows, transluced as through a membrane, luteous. A medieval monk with spectacles round like vintage Elton's. Who knew that kind of vision was possible back then? Her son a suicide, impassable the life, ever unable to translate love from the cradle to where he was. Once I touched a page of vellum made of fetal calfskin, buttery, as they say in the trade. Disruptive to the systems, anger or anchor, both velar, one voiced, one voiceless. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free, I guess, to put them in the chat.
Thank you so much for that, Moira. That was wonderful.
Thank
And
you.
thank you to everyone for let me turn this timer off. That does not look great. All right, there we are. Much better. Yeah, thank you to everyone for coming today. I wanted to read out some of these nice comments in the chat here. So thank you, Margaret and Earl and Anne and Christopher, Tennis, Suzanne, Damiano, and Roger for all saying hello. And I'd love to encourage anyone in the chat to ask any questions you have for Moira. Just put them in the chat and I will read them off to her. But yeah, I wanted to start off. I noticed you were talking about Dr. Emily Wilson's translation, which is the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English, is what I read. And I read that uh, she found whenever she was translating it that male counterparts who had translated it before had sort of added sexist and misogynist terms into the text that didn't exist in the Greek. And I was really interested in that anecdote because I thought it sort of speaks to the ways in which like classics are interpreted, but also a way to sort of reinforce the way things were.
Mm.
Like sometimes people use classics to tell us like things are always away, but that isn't the case. So I guess I wanted to start there and maybe talk about, um, do you feel like you have to make space, for feminism when you're teaching the classics? Like, is it there? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yes, but I'm happy to say that more and more young ladies speak up and say, this ain't right, and let's talk about the construct. And I don't necessarily think that's looking at things anachronistically. But I also think it opens up a space for us poets and and fiction writers too. What's Madeline Miller, I think is her name, who's written the novel Circe and also is at the Song of Achilles, to take those figures who have been interpreted in a certain way and think about what they may have been going through and and talk back to the tradition that way. And one of my particular fun hobbies is talking back to the tradition in the forms of the tradition in sonnets, which were typically, the beleaguered man trying to get with the unattainable woman. I love flipping that on its head, and having sonnets say fierce things back or just whatever else. There's no reason that a sonnet needs to be that beleaguered love boy voice speaking to a woman who isn't there.
Right. I'm really interested in that, especially from someone who doesn't have a strong poetic background. I mean, I've never really thought about this idea that there might be some kind of meaning that's like latent in a form. Like using that form can mean something. I mean, did you feel that way whenever you were kind of composing these?
Oh, yes. I that's something that I always think about, because not only does a form have a kind of historical meaning, and that's the classic one of the sonnet, but also forms um, convey meaning. And they're as much a part of the meaning as what you're trying to say. And please note, I'm putting that in those quotes. A villanelle, for example. It's a way of the one that I've taught the most is one art, which really embodies a psychological process of that sort of like two steps forward, one step back. She can't do it all at once, so she needs to go back and do the repetition before she can say the art of losing isn't hard to master, although she's not quite convinced that it is, I think, finally. Um, and Sestina, similar. And then if you're working with non-Western forms, I but I think they're an interesting way that we pay more attention to now, like ghazals, for example, rubaiyats, bringing other kinds of intricate structure in to allow for intricacy of meaning and thought. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
It does. I'm really interested in that. Like, so you use a lot of received forms in this collection, right? And then you also mentioned that you invent forms, and there was one that I saw in the last section that you just read from that seemed to evoke like the Japanese form, the haibun, which is like the
Yes.
prose followed by. I'm just curious about some other poetic forms that you could talk about that inspired the collection.
Yeah, no, that's right. So that's a trilogy that I wrote when on the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. This wonderful press in Australia, Recent Work Press, they do these thematic and kind of timely um, anthologies, and they assign poets, do this. So this one was to do three poems if you can, based on Dante. And and since I really just couldn't do a sonnet, I thought, well, why don't I do and in fact, the section it's called, and then I'll answer the rest of your question too, but it's funny. The section is called Mystical Visions of Saints and Sinners. And at first, its subtitle was A Fragrance Trilogy, which was me being very cheeky and kind of silly. But I was thinking, what would Inferno smell like? What would Purgatorio smell like? What would Paradiso smell like? And so the haiku looking thing appended to the prose poem
Right.
is the Inferno, it's some of the smelliest things you can imagine mixed together. Purgatorio would probably be a decent fragrance if you put it. And the Paradiso is like white flowers and aldehydes, and it would be so kind of airy that it might not be pleasing because it would just be like one beautiful note. So anyway, that was a weird and fun thing to play around with. But there are several poems in there that are haiku stanzas. They run through the multiple stanzas, but using 575. A couple, at least one, maybe just one, is a tanka stanza poem. So it goes through multiple tankas. I'm thinking what else? There was, of course, the putting the rhyme at the beginning of the line rather than the end. I guess there's not a sestina in this book. There are sestinas in other books, but that might have been too much. But I like, for me, it helps a lot in the working out of a poem. Once the poem, and this is going to sound weird too, the poem sort of figures out what form it needs to take. And somewhere in my brain and somewhere in the poems, whatever, they come together and like, okay, well, obviously this is going to be a villanelle or a sonnet or whatever it is. And that's when I think the better poems that I write, it already knew what it wanted to be. And then it kind of spoke to me and came out that way in a very organic kind of way. It's not, like I start writing a poem and they go, oh, this needs to be a sonnet. It knows that it's going to be a sonnet, so it starts coming out as a sonnet. That sounds weird, doesn't it?
No, it's so cool. And I'm thinking now about this crown of sonnets. Did these characters, they were like, we need to be in a crown of sonnets, like we need to be in conversation.
Yeah. They still had some more stuff that they wanted to say. So they said,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, that's all. Just so they said. And I remember when I was writing this, that was before lockdown. And I was sitting on the sofa. I don't know why I was sitting on the sofa, but I was. And I was over there chuckling. And Damiano's in the other room, like, what's so funny? I said, oh, I'm writing these sonnets in the voice of the Odyssey girls. And, they're having troubles. Anyway, but although they're not pretty or easy, all of them, it was fun. It was fun to do that.
Well, speaking of smells, I'm thinking it had to be different doing like the work of revisiting myth has to be different in Rome. I feel like where the past is kind of inescapable, than in the United States where we sort of like pretend like the past never happened. Can you talk a little bit about the place? One, the place of maybe Rome or being in Italy, but also the place of kind of lockdown, as a kind of inspiration for this work.
Yeah, as a kind of terrible inspiration.
As a
Well,
terrible inspiration.
yeah, yeah. Well, about that, it's funny because I've been here for this semester. I've been teaching at Johns Hopkins, and I'm grateful that they gave me that opportunity so that I could be here for the book, and just be on this side for a while. And I've gone to a lot of poetry readings here. People's that now books are coming out this year that are still dealing with the pandemic. So it seems pretty clear to me from California to Connecticut. I was hearing lockdown poems, and that also talks about the life cycle of how long it takes for a book of poems to get published, to be out there in the world. And I hope that it serves as a reminder that, boy, let's never let this happen again. That's a fury. Please let this not happen again. And it was of necessity a productive time for a lot of us, I think. Um, though a terrible one. We lost friends almost immediately, and I know a lot of people did. It's the funny thing is, as to living in Rome, I haven't written that much about. I have one book that's called Strange Botany, that's the coming to terms with the new landscape, basically through the metaphors of plants. The new landscape being, living in the Mediterranean for real, and having this new life as a wife, and that sort of thing. But I still haven't, I don't know why it is, but I've written one poem about Rome. And I live there and it's beautiful and I see these, and of course, and what you're saying is absolutely right. You know, there you literally can't walk down the street without coming up against a sense of a much deeper history. You know, the other year they were digging up our street to do whatever for the 15th time, and they found a Roman wall right under our windows. So they had to shut down the work, call in the archaeologists. Archaeologists came, photographed it, documented it, and then started working again. So, but that's life in Rome. There's always something. And maybe someday I'll be able to grapple with that a little bit more. But I sort of I'm not as much a I think people can contradict me. I think I'm not as much a poet of place as I am of other things. And now you're
We
going to ask me like what? And I'm going to say, I don't know.
I won't. I'll spare you. I'll spare you that. I'll spare you that.
The
I'm
five
actually
senses and synesthesia, that's what I would say. That's what I'm a poet of. And you can have them everywhere. And you do.
I want to ask you actually a craft question from Christopher. Um and he says, you employ rhyme with such sprezzatura. I'm sorry for that, butchering that
Grazie,
word.
Cristoforo,
So this
grazie.
is a nerdy craft question. Rhyme can have a tendency to elevate poetic register in terms of tone and manner, which is why it can be such a dangerous weapon, but you seem to use it in the opposite way as an instrument of play and wit, and even to help lower the poetic register.
Oh,
Can you talk a little bit about that sorcery?
ah, thank you. Yeah, I guess gratitude, attitude, and platitude was taken a little far, but I wanted to do that. That's a great question. Thank you, Christopher. Th- when I'm talking to people who haven't been writing as long as I have, which the older I get, the more that happens. Um, I think a couple of things are interesting to play with in rhyme. One is not perfect rhyme, so off rhyme, close enough. You know, did you ever see that movie called Educating Rita, in which she says, "Oh, so the poet got the rhyme wrong," and then the professor makes fun of her and he hears her and it's terrible. But anyway, that was a great movie. I like to get the rhyme wrong, but I like to get it close. I also think that enjambment is a great way to keep things moving, and you get a kind of sonic pleasure of expectation and then a little bit of a surprise because the sentence kept going, even though the rhyme sound was there. Um, and the weird thing with my anagrams, they assonate and they consonate. I know what I just made up those words. So the sound patterns work, I think, in a nice way that doesn't hit you over the head, I think. And it's just part of my weird ethos and aesthetic as a poet is that that's stuff that's always interested me. And again, that idea of talking back to the tradition in the language of the tradition, but saying, "Hey, I'm going to do something different with it." I hope that is a good answer. If not, we can continue the conversation, Christopher.
I think that was a great answer. I also wanted to um, make a nod to Suzanne in the chat who talked about COVID being a terrible and also terribly productive time for many poets, and that I think that that dichotomy that and also being in the same room really like lives a lot in this collection. So that's a great comment.
Yeah, thank you.
Christopher says, "We love your weird ethos and aesthetic," in quotes. So thank you. Um,
Thank you.
I think I had one other question, but I don't know if this is something that maybe is again as someone who is not formally trained in poetry. If this is an interesting, we don't have to talk about it, but um, do you consider yourself a formalist? Is that a term that people use, or
Oh, yeah.
I guess I wanted to ask you, not like is what is it like being a formalist? Like, what can formalism teach us in right now, and when we're in such an age of kind of free verse?
Yeah. Well, there are some of us out there who are not too embarrassed to say that we're formalists. I was teaching the introduction to fiction and poetry class this semester, and the last week is introducing poetic forms. And so on the Friday before that week, I said, "All right, you guys, now I'm really excited. Next week we're going to be doing formal poetry, so I'm going to be wearing my tuxedo on Monday." And they said, really? And I said, oh, no, no, just kidding. My tuxedo's in Rome, which of course I don't really have a tuxedo. But anyway, it was pretty funny. Um, I, as I said before, it helps me to have a sense of where I'm going, a sense of structure, a sense of support, against the terror of the blank page or the blank screen. And something that I also am always interested in is harnessing, and I'm going to go a little Greek here, but as one does, harnessing kind of Dionysian energies in Apollonian ideas of form. And the way those two energies work together, I think is very productive. And I think too that we're dealing with a lot of not Dionysian necessarily in a good way kinds of energies that are out there. And writing in, Edna St. Vincent Millay has that line, I will put chaos into 14 lines. I think it can be helpful for the poet, for the reader, and maybe for, I don't know what, to try to harness that chaos and put it in 14 lines or whatever the form is going to be. Um, and it's also, and to use another quote, Adrienne Rich said that because she started out as a very formal poet, and then stopped basically. But she said form was part of the strategy. It was like asbestos gloves that allowed me to pick up and handle material that was otherwise too hot to handle. I just mangled that quote a little bit, but I think that's useful both for the writer and for the reader, also in a way of for the reader, like, well, this is a difficult poem, but looks like the poet got through it. And I'm having issues too, and maybe I can get through them too. Poetry is way more than therapy, but I think that that kind of magical, mystical thing that poetry can do can actually be helpful, psychologically salubrious, let's say. So, was that an answer? I think.
No, that was such a fantastic answer that I am so happy that I asked that question. Um, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
I have one more question to ask you. It's a standard question that closing question that we ask our authors, which is, what are you working on now? What's next? What's coming after the Furies?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I must have a serious consultation with my muse and my crystal orbs. I think I might go in the direction of writing I know a lot of people are doing this, of writing something that's epic and long and strange. That's one possibility. I'm also fiddling around with prose. And I sort of feel like maybe I need a palate cleanser, and I'll work a little bit more on prose. So this part of this idea of you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave Catholicism is something that interests me. And that is something that would be based in the fact that I live in Rome. And, you can't swing anything without hitting three churches. So, and, the complicated feelings I have about that and the uniquely weird history that I have with my schooling and all that kind of stuff. But that I'll leave it at that. But I don't know. Um, uh, but also the last few poems that I've written that have turned out to be actual poems have been about insects. Yes, I said insects, bugs. And I think that a dear friend of mine named Sophia uh, has influenced me in that, of whom we speak. But anyway, maybe I'll write a book of bug poems. Who knows? But those other things are probably more likely. But anyway, thank you. This was fun. I hope my audience had fun.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you so much for being here with us. I'm very excited for your book of ent what is it, entomological poems. I mean, there really isn't anything more classical than bugs in a way. I mean,
yeah,
bugs are ancient.
yeah, they
Um,
are. They are. So maybe so. Etymological work. Ha ha. Yes.
I want to thank everyone in the chat for tuning in. and spending either your afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world with us. And just to remind everyone, there is a link to Moira's book in the chat for 40% off. So it's a great time to get it. And I will see you all for our next live launch. Moira, is there anything else? Would you like to sign us off?
I would just like to say thank you. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, LSU Press. I'm really, it's a beautiful book. I mean, it's a beautiful object, and I'm so happy with it, and I'm really honored. So thanks to everyone. And thank you, audience, folks, for being here. I appreciate you taking the time. And have a lovely rest of whatever it is that you have.
All right.
Bye.